From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
What to watch on primary night in New York and Florida as a judge orders the government to propose redactions in the Mar-a-Lago search affidavit. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial writer Monet Ukwe-Barua. Welcome to you both. So voters today are going to the polls in a few states, but let's start with New York and the rumble in the concrete jungle, the east side versus the west side. Two Democratic heavyweights, Jerry Nadler and Carolyn Maloney, both have been in Congress since the 1990s, early 1990s. And the story here, Kim, is that Manhattan used to be split into two districts, roughly lengthwise. And one had the east side, one had the west side. And the latest redistricting map unites those two into one district. So now we have a real race here. And the money seems to be on Jerry Nadler. He picked up the endorsement of Senator Chuck Schumer. And here's Carolyn Maloney responding.
Well, he doesn't live here, and it doesn't surprise me. The Old Boys Network is very, very close, and they support each other. And we know that women are very underrepresented in Congress. We're 51% of the population, but 24% of electeds across the country. 1 in 4 people is a woman. We need more women's voices, and when women are in the room and part of the decision-making, the conversation changes, and it focuses on children and families, health care, clean environment, and investment in the future.
Now, Kim, I imagine that Jerry Nadler would probably take exception to the idea that he doesn't care about children and families in the future. But what do you make of this race and the arguments that the candidates are making?
This really is Clash of the Titans, because if you look at these two candidates, they have both served in Congress for decades. Jerry Nadler is the head of the powerful House Judiciary Committee. Maloney is head of the powerful Oversight Committee in the House. She is definitely hitting on the women's point because it looks as though in most of the polls, Nadler is outpacing her. This almost seems like a little bit like a Hail Mary for her to land on an issue to sort of mobilize the women's vote. Nadler's got Schumer's endorsement, Elizabeth Warren's endorsement, the Working Families Party endorsement. She has a few women's groups supporting her. But one of the other interesting aspects of this is that Maloney was actually primaried in 2020 and barely came out and won. And it was by someone named Suraj Patel, who is also a third candidate in this, just as it happens. But I think it points to some weakness that she already had in the district. And right now it looks as though Nadler may come out on top.
The other thing I think important to keep in mind is how we got here, the combining of these districts and the problems that Democrats in New York are having because of this new redistricting map. And this is not the only problem they're having, are the fault of the Democrats in Albany. And just as a reminder, in 2014, voters in New York passed a constitutional amendment that gave the redistricting process over to an independent commission and also included a ban on partisan redistricting for partisan gain. And we know now how this worked out. The commission, when they came back to do the 2020 redistricting after the census, they split on partisan lines. They couldn't get an agreement. And then the state legislature drew its own map and thumbing its nose at voters the very first chance it got, it drew a pretty strong gerrymander to help Democrats pick up seats in the House, in the state houses. And so, Monet, then what happened was the courts came in and the courts said, nope, look, we have a constitutional amendment that bans partisan gerrymandering. And so the courts appointed somebody who drew his own map, and that person did not take into account one of the things that state legislatures love to do when they redistrict, which is to keep incumbents away from each other. That guy started with a clean slate and said, what's the best way to split up a district in Manhattan? And now here we have the results.
Yeah, that sounds exactly right to me. I'd back up even further and say another way that the Democrats brought this on themselves is by losing a House seat in the state of New York, which was a consequence of the declining population in that state, which we know is in some significant part a consequence of very, very high taxes and cost of living as people have fled. And so if you're going to have redistricting, you want it to be in a state that's growing where you're adding seats as opposed to one where you're losing seats and then have the potential for incumbents to have to be pushed together into particular districts. But as regards the gerrymander, I would agree that the process we saw in Albany really showed that there is no way to have some kind of perfect neutral redrawing of a map when you have a state-appointed commissioner. We saw that the map that was drawn by this appointed person after the court ruling actually did tilt in a Democratic direction, probably even more than the previous map. Maybe not quite as much as the one that Democrats had drawn themselves, but still, it certainly wasn't free of any bias. But also, it did have the consequence that you pointed out, in that Democrats weren't able to choose the areas that they wanted to redraw and combine. If you look at the map, it does seem to make a little bit more geographical sense. You don't have these very strange shapes in New York City the way that you had in the previous map. The areas are a little bit more contiguous, but Democrats lost their ability to decide who was going to be able to run where. And I think it's just another point confirming the longstanding truth that drawing these maps is an inherently political process. There's no way to maximize them either for competitive balance or for geographic integrity in a way that's going to balance all the different interests that you might have. And it just makes sense to allow state legislatures to draw these maps competitively.
Another one of the problems that was created is now playing out a little bit north of New York. So Sean Patrick Maloney, a powerful Democrat who is chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, he decided that he would run in the new 17th district. And that was where most of that territory had previously been represented by a different Democrat, Mondaire Jones. So he decided that he would move to a different district. But strangely enough, the redistricting map made sure that Mondaire Jones was not actually in the 17th district anyway. His actual residence was in the 16th district with another Democrat. So there was a lot of real reshuffling after the map came out. So Kim, now we have a primary here, Sean Patrick Maloney. He's running for this primary reelection. He's facing a progressive challenger who's endorsed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And it seems like he is probably going to emerge okay from this primary, though this will be another one to keep an eye on to gauge the strength of the progressive opposition to these more mainstream Democratic candidates.
Yeah, this has been another very, very bitter race, that whole scenario that you just laid out. Sean Patrick Maloney is the head of the DCCC, obviously the campaign arm that looks to elect more House Democrats. And when he announced that he was going to run in the 17th district, there was such bitterness in the Democratic caucus because it put Mondaire Jones, who is a big progressive, in a situation where he had to go to another district. People felt that Sean Patrick Maloney was bigfooting, and there were even charges of kind of racism in that he's white, Mondaire Jones is black. I mean, it got very, very ugly. He is running against Alessandra Biaggi, who is a state senator at the moment, backed by Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. So you're getting this kind of pitting, as it were, between the standard liberal Democrat and the very progressive Democrat. Let's be clear, both of these people are very far to the left. Sean Patrick Maloney, despite all this bitterness, has retained the endorsement of none other than Nancy Pelosi. So some people are also viewing this as another face-off between Pelosi and the squad. And we'll see where all this comes out. Some of the more recent polling suggests that Maloney is very well positioned to win this seat. But again, overall, between the Nadler and the Maloney fight and the Sean Patrick Maloney and the Mondaire Jones fight, and then the pileup that is the New York 10th, the open seat where Mondaire Jones is gone, where so many candidates are running, New York is really turning into a headache for Democrats. It was supposed to be one of the bright lights. In fact, they were counting on the state and this gerrymander to ensure that they racked up a blue wall, as it were, to guard against some of the other losses in moderate districts across the country they're likely to see. Instead, this state is becoming one of the biggest nightmares of the cycle for them.
And the irony is, if they had been just a little bit less aggressive and less obvious with this partisan gerrymander, they might have gotten away with it. They might have been able to pick up a seat or two, but they really went all the way as far as they could. They just couldn't help themselves. Monet, the other district that I would highlight in New York is a special election. This is in the 19th Congressional District in the Hudson Valley, and it was previously held by Democrat Antonio Delgado, who accepted the lieutenant governor nod after Kathy Hochul was elevated to the governorship. And so now there's a race to replace him, and this is kind of a swing district, pretty center, maybe a little bit right of center. And this is a special election again. So you have, instead of a primary, you have a Republican versus Democrat. You have Republican Mark Molinaro there against Democrat Pat Ryan. And this could be one that Monet suggests gives a little bit of a flavor of where things could be going in November.
Yeah, I'm glad that you highlighted the 19th district race because, as listeners know, New York is a very, very heavily Democratic state, which means that most of these races are sort of internal politics among Democrats, not even necessarily factions among Democrats. You mostly have a lot of very progressive candidates running against each other. But having this special election here to fill this seat is one where we do get a potential foretaste of what to expect in November because this district is such a consistent swing location. I actually took a look and saw that it has gone with the presidential side in presidential elections that won in each election since 1996. So it tends to be a good indicator of sort of the political standing in the country. We saw in the most recent election 4 years ago that Antonio Delgado was able to narrowly defeat John Faso, a Republican, and now the polls have showed Molinaro and Pat Ryan very, very close. It's small, so it's tough to get a sense of the polling. It doesn't necessarily reflect the outcome super well. But yeah, I mean, I think voters will see the outcome of this election as a little bit of a preview. So that's one that listeners should make sure to watch.